Get ready for 3 spine-chilling winter horror stories that will freeze your blood. From cursed villages to haunted asylums, these tales will leave you questioning what lurks in the snow. Like, subscribe, and comment your favorite story or scariest winter memory to support our channel. Let the frostbitten terror begin, if you dare. The blizzard arrived without warning. One moment, the village was serene under a pale winter sun. The next, a wall of white consumed the landscape. Riley, a part-time courier, had been delivering packages to the outskirts when the storm swallowed her. She'd planned a quick return to town, but the howling winds forced her to abandon her van and seek refuge. As she trudged through knee-deep snow, her flashlight cut through the dense flakes, revealing an old church standing alone in the wilderness. Its spire jutted into the swirling sky like a jagged tooth, and the windows glowed faintly with the promise of warmth. Desperation outweighed suspicion, and Riley pushed open the heavy wooden door. Inside, the air was eerily still, the storm's roar muffled by the thick stone walls. Candles flickered along the pews, casting long shadows that danced like restless spirits. She called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" No answer. Riley moved toward the altar, her boots echoing on the frozen floor. A massive crucifix loomed above her, but instead of Christ, it bore a featureless figure, its face a smooth plane of black stone. Beneath it lay a cracked offering bowl filled with what looked like teeth. The wind outside screamed louder, and the candles extinguished all at once. Riley froze as the door behind her slammed shut. From the darkness, a low voice hissed, "You shouldn't have come here." Riley's breath caught in her throat as the darkness closed in around her. Her flashlight flickered, the beam weak and trembling, barely illuminating the altar. The bowl of teeth seemed to glint in the faint light, almost as if they were watching her. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The only reply was the storm's distant howl, muted and eerie. She moved backward, her boots crunching against something brittle on the stone floor. Shining the flashlight downward, she gasped. Beneath her feet lay more teeth, scattered haphazardly like fallen leaves. Some were cracked, others pristine, but all were unnervingly human. The voice came again, a low whisper that seemed to echo inside her skull. "You brought it with you. You must leave before it wakes." "Leave?" Riley barked a humorless laugh, her nerves fraying. "There's a blizzard out there. Who are you? What's going on?" The reply was silence. Then, faintly, the sound of shuffling footsteps echoed from deeper within the church. Riley swung the flashlight wildly, the beam catching glimpses of decayed pews and dust-covered statues. The shuffling grew louder, closer, coming from all directions. Her flashlight flickered again, plunging her into complete darkness for a heartbeat. When it came back, a figure stood at the altar. It was cloaked in black, its face obscured by a pale, featureless mask. The figure raised a hand, long fingers pointing directly at her. The wind outside roared as the candles along the pews reignited all at once, their flames now blue. Shadows writhed unnaturally, pooling on the floor and slithering toward her. Panic overtook her, and she sprinted toward the door, yanking on the handle. It wouldn't budge. The figure at the altar stepped down, its movements slow and deliberate, the shadows following like loyal pets. "Let me out!" Riley screamed, pounding on the door. Her flashlight flickered again, but this time, when the light returned, the church was empty. No figure, no shadows, no teeth. Only a single word carved into the door. "Run." Riley's heartbeat thundered in her ears. The word on the door, "Run," seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. She tugged at the handle again, but the door was frozen shut, ice creeping along its edges like veins. The church was quiet now, too quiet. She turned slowly, gripping her flashlight tightly, and scanned the pews. Everything appeared untouched, as though nothing had happened. But the air felt heavier, colder, and there was a faint noise, an echoing drip, 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 coming from somewhere deeper inside the church. Despite every instinct screaming for her to stay near the door, she followed the sound. Her boots crunched on the frosty floor as she stepped cautiously down a side aisle. The sound grew louder as she neared a small door marked Crypt. "Nope," Riley muttered, stepping back. But as she turned, the door creaked open on its own. The drip became a gurgling, wet sound, like something moving sluggishly through thick mud. A cold wind rushed up from the dark staircase below, carrying the scent of decay. She hesitated, her flashlight beam trembling as it revealed the stone steps descending into blackness. She didn't want to go down there, but something, a faint whisper in her mind, urged her forward. The stairs were slick with ice, and her breath fogged the air as she descended. The gurgling sound grew louder, now mixed with faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. At the bottom, the flashlight illuminated a massive underground chamber. The walls were carved with intricate patterns, spirals, and jagged lines that hurt her eyes if she stared too long. In the center of the room was a shallow pool of black water. Floating in it was a figure. It was humanoid but grotesquely misshapen. Its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its skin was translucent, pulsing faintly with an inner light. As Riley stepped closer, her foot splashed in the water. The figure's head snapped toward her, empty sockets locking onto her. It began to rise. Riley stumbled back, her flashlight flickering wildly. As it blinked out, the whispers crescendoed, and the thing's voice hissed from the darkness. "You've disturbed the Frost's keeper." Riley's legs felt like they were sinking into the icy stone as the figure rose from the pool. Its elongated limbs moved unnaturally, its translucent skin rippling as though something lived beneath it. The whispers in the chamber turned into a cacophony, an unholy chant in a language she couldn't understand. The creature stepped out of the water, and frost spread from its feet with each step, creeping toward Riley. She stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering, revealing glimpses of its skeletal frame and the black veins coursing through its body. Desperate, Riley screamed, "Stay back!" She grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it at the thing. The stone struck its chest, but instead of recoiling, the creature tilted its head as if studying her. Then it opened its mouth, a black, gaping void, and exhaled a cloud of freezing mist. The frost surged faster, reaching her boots and climbing up her legs. The cold was unbearable, searing through her bones. Her breaths came out in shallow gasps, crystallizing in the frigid air. She turned and bolted up the stairs, slipping and stumbling as the frost chased her. When she reached the top, the door to the crypt slammed shut behind her, and the frost stopped abruptly at the threshold. She leaned against the wall, trembling, her teeth chattering violently. The whispers had stopped, replaced by silence so thick it pressed against her ears. Her flashlight flickered back to life, casting its beam across the church. Something was wrong. The pews were gone, replaced by rows of standing figures, their faces obscured by pale, featureless masks. They didn't move, but their presence was suffocating. "Get out," a voice whispered, louder and clearer than before. It didn't come from the figures, but seemed to echo from the very walls. Riley turned toward the door, which was now free of ice. She sprinted to it, wrenching it open, and stumbled into the blizzard. The storm had worsened, the snow falling in dense, suffocating sheets. She turned back toward the church, but it was gone. Only an expanse of unbroken snow remained. The wind howled, carrying a single word in its icy grip: "Run." Riley trudged through the blizzard, her legs burning with exhaustion. The snow felt endless, an unbroken sea of white that swallowed everything. She looked back again, hoping the church would reappear, but there was only the storm and the faint trace of her footsteps, already vanishing beneath the falling snow. The wind screamed louder, almost mocking her. Her flashlight was dying, its beam flickering and barely piercing the storm. With every step, the snow seemed to grow deeper, threatening to swallow her whole. Her fingers and toes were numb, her breath ragged and painful in the frigid air. Panic surged as she realized she had no idea where she was going. The storm had obliterated all sense of direction, and the horizon was a swirling void. She tried to focus on moving forward, but her mind raced with what she'd seen: the creature, the crypt, the masks. The word "run" echoed in her head like a drumbeat. Then she saw it, a faint light in the distance. Relief coursed through her as she stumbled toward it, hoping it was a cabin, a car, or anything resembling safety. As she neared, the light resolved into a lantern swinging gently in the wind, hanging from a wooden post. Beneath the lantern was a sign, its surface weathered and cracked. She wiped away the frost, revealing a single word carved into the wood: "Welcome." A path stretched beyond the post, flanked by tall, snow-covered pines that seemed to lean inward, forming a tunnel. The light of the lantern barely illuminated the path's entrance, which was darker than it should have been. Riley hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to turn back. But where could she go? The storm was merciless, and she was already losing strength. The trees whispered as she stepped onto the path, their branches creaking and groaning like ancient voices. The air grew heavier, colder, and the snow seemed to hush its fall, leaving an eerie stillness. She glanced behind her, but the lantern had vanished, leaving her surrounded by towering shadows. A new sound rose, footsteps in the snow, not hers. They were heavy, deliberate, and they were getting closer. She spun around, flashlight trembling in her hand, but there was nothing. Only the trees, their shadows shifting unnaturally. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice swallowed by the dark. The footsteps stopped, and a low, guttural voice whispered from the void. "You can't leave now." Riley's breath came in shallow, icy gasps as she clutched her flashlight, its flickering beam slicing through the oppressive dark. The footsteps resumed, slow and deliberate, crunching through the snow. They circled her, growing louder, then softer, as if the unseen presence was toying with her. "Show yourself!" she screamed, spinning wildly. Her voice echoed back, distorted and mocking. The path ahead twisted unnaturally, the trees looming closer as though trying to trap her. Shadows crawled along the ground, moving against the direction of her flashlight. A sharp crack behind her made her whirl around. Standing in the path was a figure cloaked in white, its face obscured by a hood. The air around it shimmered with frost, and snowflakes seemed to fall upward in its presence. What do you want?" Riley stammered, backing away. The figure raised a hand, and the snow beneath her feet shifted violently. She fell to her knees, her hands plunging into the freezing cold. Beneath the snow, she felt something solid and smooth. Digging frantically, she unearthed a piece of wood, a splintered plank etched with words. "This is where they fall." Panic surged through her as she scrambled to her feet, clutching the plank. The figure had vanished, but the oppressive cold remained. The path stretched endlessly, and the whispers from the trees grew louder, their language incomprehensible, yet deeply wrong. She ran, the trees seeming to close in, tighter with every step. Her flashlight died completely, leaving her in total darkness. The only light came from faint blue glimmers that danced along the path, leading her forward like will-o'-the-wisps. Then the path ended abruptly, opening into a vast clearing. In its center stood a massive frozen lake. Its surface was eerily smooth, reflecting the storm above with unnatural clarity. Shapes moved beneath the ice, distorted and shadowy, their movements deliberate. A single figure stood at the lake's edge, its back to her. Its posture was rigid, unnatural, as if its body was barely holding itself together. Riley's legs refused to move, but the figure turned slowly, revealing its face, or what should have been a face. Instead, there was a smooth, black void, reflecting her own terrified expression. It raised a skeletal hand and pointed to the lake. The shadows beneath the ice surged upward, and cracks began to spiderweb across the surface. A deep, resonant voice filled the air. "You've seen too much. Now join us." The ice groaned beneath her feet, and she fell forward as it began to shatter. The ice splintered beneath Riley's hands and knees, the cracks spreading like lightning across the frozen lake. The shapes beneath the surface moved faster, their distorted forms pressing against the ice as if desperate to break free. Cold mist seeped from the fractures, chilling her to her core. She scrambled backward, but the ice wouldn't hold. It groaned and buckled with every movement, the water below dark and bottomless. The hooded figure with the smooth black void for a face stepped closer, its hand still pointing at her. "Stay away!" Riley screamed, her voice echoing into the empty expanse. The figure tilted its head, as if amused. Around her, the shadows under the ice began to take form. Faces, twisted, frozen in anguish, stared up at her. They pressed against the surface, their mouths opening in silent screams. The ice gave way completely, plunging her into the frigid water. It hit like 1,000 needles, piercing her skin, stealing her breath and numbing her limbs. She thrashed, desperate for air, but something wrapped around her ankle, dragging her downward. The faces surrounded her, their expressions shifting between sorrow and fury. Their whispers filled her ears, the same words repeating over and over. "You belong here. You were chosen." Riley clawed at the water, her lungs burning. Above her, the surface of the lake seemed impossibly far, and the storm raged on, indifferent to her struggle. The shadows pulled her deeper, their icy grip tightening as they dragged her into the black abyss. Then she saw it. At the very bottom of the lake, glowing faintly, was the altar from the church. The same smooth black bowl rested on it, but this time it overflowed with teeth. The hooded figure was there, waiting. It raised its arms, and the shadows obeyed, pulling her closer. Riley's mind screamed as the cold and the darkness consumed her. The last thing she saw was her own reflection in the void of the figure's face, her mouth open, eyes wide in silent terror. Weeks later, a search party found her van buried in snow, but no trace of Riley was ever recovered. The storm had erased all signs of her existence. On quiet winter nights, travelers still claimed to hear whispers in the woods, faint and chilling, carried by the wind. Run before it finds you. It was supposed to be a simple trip. Eric and his girlfriend Mia were heading to a remote cabin in the mountains for a quiet winter getaway. The snowstorm arrived earlier than forecasted, turning the winding road into a treacherous ice trap. When their car skidded off the road into a snowbank, they decided to wait for help. Hours passed, and the biting cold seeped through the car. Their phones had no signal, and the dense forest swallowed any sound. When the storm eased, they spotted lights flickering through the trees, faint but promising. "Could be a house," Eric said, his breath fogging the air. Mia hesitated. "It's too far. What if we get lost?" "Do we have a choice?" Eric countered. The lights flickered again, faintly pulsating, like lanterns swaying in the wind. With no other option, they set off, trudging through the knee-deep snow. The cold bit at their skin, and every step was a struggle. The lights led them to a sprawling building, a crumbling, snow-covered structure that loomed ominously in the dark. An old sign creaked in the wind above the entrance, its lettering faded but still legible. Ashwood Asylum. Mia froze. "This place, it's abandoned, isn't it?" Eric didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the door, which stood slightly ajar. Warm light spilled from inside, and faint, muffled voices reached their ears. "Maybe someone's still here," he said, gripping her hand. As they stepped inside, the voices stopped abruptly. The warm light disappeared, plunging the hall into pitch black. From somewhere deep within the asylum, a faint sound emerged, the soft creak of wheels rolling across the floor, drawing closer. The creaking sound grew louder, echoing through the silent, freezing hallways. Eric flicked on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. Dust motes danced in the air, disturbed by the frigid breeze blowing through the asylum. "Hello?" Eric called, his voice trembling. The creaking stopped. Mia grabbed his arm. "We need to leave. Now." Eric hesitated, his flashlight catching peeling paint and shattered glass along the walls. "Someone could be here. They might have a phone, or a way to help us." Mia opened her mouth to argue, but then they heard it again, closer this time. The rhythmic creak of wheels rolling, accompanied by a faint metallic rattle. The sound seemed to come from the hallway to their left, disappearing into the darkness. "Stay here," Eric whispered, taking a cautious step toward the noise. "Are you insane?" Mia hissed, but Eric was already moving, his flashlight bobbing with each step. The corridor stretched endlessly, its walls lined with old patient rooms. Most of the doors hung ajar, revealing rotting furniture and scattered papers. The creaking grew louder, stopping just as Eric reached a corner. He turned the beam of his flashlight, and his breath caught. A wheelchair sat in the center of the hallway, its metal frame corroded with rust. It faced him, motionless. "Eric!" Mia's voice was a distant echo behind him. "It's just an old chair," he called back, his voice hollow. As he approached, his flashlight flickered, the shadows around him twisting unnaturally. When he reached the wheelchair, he noticed something strange. Deep scratches marred the floor beneath it, as if it had been forcibly dragged. Then, with a loud screech, the chair moved on its own, rolling backward and slamming into the wall. Eric stumbled back, his heart pounding. The flashlight flickered again, and in the brief moment of darkness, he saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, a gaunt silhouette with hollow, staring eyes. Before he could shout, the figure lunged and the flashlight died completely. Eric's scream echoed through the dark as the figure rushed toward him. A freezing gust of wind slammed into him, knocking him backward. He scrambled on the icy floor, fumbling with the flashlight, smacking it until the beam sputtered back to life. The hallway was empty. The wheelchair lay on its side, one wheel spinning lazily. "Eric!" Mia's voice cut through the silence, panicked and close. He spun around to see her running toward him, her face pale. "What happened? I heard there was someone here," Eric stammered, his voice shaking. Mia grabbed his arm, dragging him back toward the main hallway. "We're leaving, right now." But as they turned the corner, the door they'd entered through was gone. The hallway stretched infinitely in both directions, the cracked tiles and flaking paint disorienting in their uniformity. "What the hell?" Mia whispered, spinning in place. Eric's flashlight beam landed on a metal plaque bolted to the wall. Ward C. Below it, an arrow pointed down a corridor that ended in a heavy steel door. A deep, resonant clang reverberated through the asylum, followed by the faint sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. "No," Mia said, backing away. "We're not going in there." "We don't have a choice," Eric muttered, gripping her hand tightly. Together, they crept down the corridor toward the door. The steel door bore deep gouges, as though something had clawed at it. Eric hesitated before turning the rusted handle. The door groaned open, revealing a dark, narrow stairwell descending into the depths of the asylum. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoed from below. Eric shone the flashlight down the stairs. A single wheelchair sat at the bottom, bathed in dim, flickering light. And then, the tapping stopped. The wheelchair began to roll slowly up the stairs toward them, defying gravity. From below, a guttural voice rasped, "You shouldn't have come here." The wheelchair rolled closer, its wheels squeaking eerily on the steps. Eric and Mia froze, their breath visible in the icy air. The guttural voice echoed again, louder this time, as though it came from the walls themselves. "You brought it back." "What does that mean?" Mia whispered, clutching Eric's arm. Eric shook his head, his flashlight trembling as he pointed it at the stairwell. The wheelchair stopped on the landing below them, swaying gently. The light flickered, and for a split second, the seat of the chair appeared soaked with something dark, almost black. Then it was gone, and the chair sat empty again. "Let's leave it," Eric said, pulling Mia back. But the hallway behind them seemed to stretch endlessly now, warped and twisted. The storm outside had become utterly silent, as if the asylum existed in a separate frozen void. The only way forward was down. "We don't have a choice," Eric murmured, taking Mia's hand and leading her toward the stairs. The air grew colder with every step. The rhythmic tapping resumed, louder now, reverberating through the narrow space. Eric's flashlight cast long, jagged shadows on the stone walls. When they reached the bottom, they found themselves in another corridor, narrower and darker than the ones above. Faded signs on the walls read, "Isolation Ward" and "Experimental Therapy." The tapping had stopped, replaced by faint whispers that seemed to come from every direction. Mia pointed to a door slightly ajar. "Look!" Inside was a room filled with rusted medical equipment and shattered glass. In the center of the room stood a table, its surface scratched and dented. Something shiny glinted atop it. Eric approached cautiously, his flashlight revealing a brass key. Before he could grab it, the whispers turned into anguished screams, and the door slammed shut behind them. The table began to shake violently, and the key slid to the floor. A new sound joined the cacophony, heavy footsteps pounding down the hall outside the room. Mia grabbed Eric's arm, her eyes wide with terror. "It's coming!" The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Then, slowly, the handle began to turn. The door creaked open, and the screams instantly stopped, replaced by deafening silence. Eric and Mia pressed themselves against the wall, barely daring to breathe. The beam of Eric's flashlight trembled, illuminating the open doorway. A figure stood there, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and hunched, its body draped in tattered hospital robes, stained with dark streaks. Its head hung at an unnatural angle, as if its neck had been broken. The The figure stepped into the room, its movements jerky and deliberate. A guttural wheeze escaped its throat as it sniffed the air. Eric motioned for Mia to stay quiet, but she was already gripping his arm so tightly it hurt. His flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, the figure's face was visible, a grotesque, hollow visage with empty eye sockets that seemed to stare straight through them. The key lay on the floor, just a few feet away. Eric's pulse raced. He gestured to Mia, mouthing the words, "Stay still." Slowly, he crouched and reached for the key. His fingers brushed the cold brass just as the figure's head snapped toward him with a sickening crack. It let out an ear-splitting shriek, lunging forward with unnatural speed. Eric grabbed the key and scrambled backward, narrowly avoiding its outstretched hands. The thing clawed at the air, its wheezing breath filling the room. "Run!" Eric yelled, grabbing Mia's hand and pulling her toward the hallway. They stumbled out, slamming the door behind them. The figure's shrieks grew louder, followed by the sound of pounding on the door. They sprinted down the corridor, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. Eric clutched the key tightly, his mind racing. "What does it open?" Mia panted, glancing over her shoulder. "I don't know," Eric snapped. Ahead, another heavy steel door loomed, its surface covered in scratches and strange symbols. A small keyhole glinted in the flickering light. Eric jammed the key into the lock, turning it with trembling hands. The door groaned open, revealing a pitch-black void beyond. A faint, rhythmic heartbeat echoed from the darkness. From behind them came the sound of splintering wood as the creature broke through the door. "Go!" Eric shouted, pulling Mia through the doorway just as the creature's shriek filled the corridor. As they stepped into the darkness, the door slammed shut behind them, leaving them in utter silence. The silence was suffocating. Eric's flashlight barely pierced the darkness, revealing jagged stone walls that seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. The rhythmic heartbeat they had heard earlier now resonated all around them, deep and ominous. "Where are we?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Eric shook his head, his grip on her hand tightening. "It's like we've gone under the asylum. This wasn't on any map." The floor beneath their feet felt wrong, soft and damp, like flesh instead of stone. Mia shuddered, trying to avoid looking down. The heartbeat grew louder as they moved forward, the oppressive darkness giving way to a faint, sickly red glow. The corridor widened into a cavernous chamber. At its center stood a grotesque structure, pulsating like a living organism. Black veins twisted across its surface, pumping a thick, viscous liquid that dripped onto the floor. "Is that alive?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Eric could answer, a sharp whisper echoed through the chamber. "You've found the heart. Now you must feed it." They spun around, but there was no one there. Shadows danced on the walls, moving without any visible source. Eric approached the pulsating structure, his flashlight beam revealing deep gouges in the surrounding floor. Bones, human and animal, littered the space around it. A brass plaque was embedded in the base, its inscription partially obscured by black ooze. Eric wiped it clean, revealing the words, "The price of trespass is blood." Behind them, the sound of footsteps returned, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. They turned to see the hunched figure from the corridor, its hollow face now inches from them. Before they could react, it lunged at Eric, clawing at his arm. He cried out, shoving it away, but the creature was relentless. "Eric!" Mia screamed, grabbing a jagged bone from the floor and striking the figure. It let out a shriek and recoiled, but the sound seemed to awaken the pulsating heart. The chamber shook violently, and the red glow intensified. Black tendrils erupted from the walls, writhing and lashing toward them. The figure snarled and lunged again, this time at Mia. Eric grabbed the bone from her and drove it into the creature's chest. It let out an unearthly wail as its body disintegrated into ash, but the tendrils continued their advance. "Run!" Eric yelled, pulling Mia toward a narrow passage on the far side of the chamber. The heartbeat quickened, and the walls began to collapse behind them. Eric and Mia ran through the collapsing corridor, the pulsating tendrils lashing out from the walls. The rhythmic heartbeat grew deafening, pounding in their chests like a drum, summoning something ancient and malevolent. The narrow passage twisted and turned, but there was no end in sight. Each step felt heavier, as if the very air around them was dragging them back toward the heart of the asylum. "We can't outrun it!" Mia shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. Eric stumbled, clutching the wound on his arm from the creature's claws. His blood stained the walls as they passed, and each droplet seemed to feed the tendrils, which grew stronger, faster. "There has to be a way out," Eric gasped, shining the flashlight ahead. The passage suddenly opened into another cavernous room, eerily similar to the first. At its center stood an altar carved from black stone, surrounded by symbols etched into the floor. On the altar lay a small, ornate dagger. A voice echoed through the chamber, low and guttural. "The heart demands a life. The balance must be restored." Mia backed away, shaking her head. No, we're not doing this." Eric stumbled toward the altar, the dagger glinting in the faint light. "It's asking for a sacrifice," he muttered. "It's the only way to stop this." "No," Mia cried, grabbing his arm. "We'll find another way." The tendrils burst into the room, writhing and snapping like living chains. They wrapped around Eric's legs, pulling him toward the altar. He struggled, the dagger now in his hands. "Mia, go!" he shouted. "It won't stop unless one of us—" "No!" she screamed, grabbing the dagger. "We'll fight it together." But the tendrils tightened, and the heartbeat became a deafening roar. The ground beneath them cracked, revealing an abyss filled with shifting shadows. The altar pulsed, its black surface glowing faintly, and the voice boomed, "Choose, or both shall fall." Eric met Mia's tearful gaze, his own filled with resolve. "I can't let it take you." Before she could stop him, he plunged the dagger into his own chest. The tendrils recoiled instantly, and the chamber shook violently. The altar absorbed the blood, its glow intensifying until it was blinding. Mia screamed as Eric collapsed, his body dissolving into ash. The heartbeat slowed, the tendrils retreated, and the cavern began to crumble. Mia fled, her screams echoing through the empty halls. When she finally reached the surface, the storm had stopped, and the asylum was gone, replaced by an endless snow-covered wasteland. She collapsed to her knees, clutching the dagger now pulsing faintly in her hands. Behind her, a voice whispered, "The heart never sleeps." It started with a rumor. The small, isolated village of Glens Hollow was said to be cursed, blanketed in snow that never melted, even in the height of summer. Jack, a journalist chasing the next big story, decided to investigate. The locals in the nearby town warned him against it, spinning tales of people vanishing, eerie whispers in the woods, and eyes watching from the frost-covered trees. Jack dismissed it as superstition. He packed his camera, notebook, and a thermal coat, driving deep into the wilderness. The snow began long before he reached the village, heavy and unrelenting. By the time he arrived, the road was completely buried, forcing him to park his car and continue on foot. Glens Hollow was a ghost town. The houses stood eerily still, their roofs weighed down by thick layers of snow. Frost crawled up the windows, and icicles hung like teeth from the eaves. There were no footprints, no smoke from chimneys. Just an unnatural silence that seemed to press against Jack's ears. He called out, his voice echoing in the still air, but there was no response. As he wandered through the deserted streets, he noticed something strange. Every house had a mark etched into the door, a symbol of a snowflake, perfectly symmetrical, as though carved by an unseen hand. His camera whirred as he snapped photos of the marks. But as he turned a corner, he froze. In the distance, near the village center, stood a figure. It was cloaked in white, its face obscured by a hood, and it didn't move. "Hello?" Jack called, waving. The figure remained motionless. When he stepped closer, the figure turned slowly and began walking away, disappearing into the forest beyond the village. Jack hesitated, but curiosity got the better of him. He followed, his boots crunching through the snow. The forest was darker than it should have been, the trees unnaturally close together. The deeper he went, the colder it became, the air biting at his skin even through his coat. Then, abruptly, the trail ended. The figure was gone. Behind him, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come." Jack spun around, his flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness of the forest. Snowflakes fell steadily, muffling every sound. But the voice that had whispered, low, raspy, and far too close, still echoed in his mind. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling. silence. He stood frozen, his breath fogging in the freezing air, until a crunching sound broke the stillness. It came from deeper within the woods, deliberate and slow, like someone, or something, walking toward him. Jack's flashlight beam wavered as he scanned the trees. The figure was gone, but something else caught his eye. A second set of footprints in the snow, circling him. They were large and barefoot, the toes splayed unnaturally wide. He crouched down to inspect them, only to realize the snow around the prints wasn't melting, despite his body heat. Instead, frost crept outward, crystallizing the surrounding ground. He recoiled, stumbling backward, his camera swinging from his neck. Suddenly, the forest seemed to close in, the trees leaning unnaturally close together. The air grew impossibly cold, and the faint sound of whispers began again, not from one voice, but many, overlapping and indistinct. Jack's head swiveled as he tried to pinpoint their source, but they came from every direction. He turned back toward the village, only to find the path he had taken was gone, erased by the snowfall. The trees were different now, gnarled and twisted, their branches forming grotesque shapes that loomed over him. The whispers grew louder, forming words. The frost takes what it is owed. Jack's heart pounded as he started to run, but the deeper he went, the more the forest seemed to shift, the trees forming walls of ice. His flashlight flickered, then went out completely. In the darkness, he heard it. The crunch of snow, slow and deliberate, heading straight for him. He fumbled with his camera, the flash his only source of light. When he snapped a photo, the momentary burst illuminated something standing inches from his face, its eyes hollow, its skin frostbitten and cracked. Before he could scream, the flash died, plunging him into darkness once more. Jack stumbled backward, his breath hitching in panic. His hands fumbled with the camera, but the flash wouldn't fire again. The darkness around him felt alive, pressing in from every side. The crunching footsteps resumed, slow and deliberate, circling him. "Who are you?" he shouted into the void, his voice breaking. The whispers returned, louder now, layered and echoing. "You brought the warmth, but the cold always wins." Jack's pulse raced as his flashlight flickered back to life. The weak beam illuminated the snow-covered ground, the twisted trees, and nothing else. Whatever had been inches from him was gone, leaving only the frostbitten footprints leading deeper into the forest. Desperation gnawed at him. He turned in the direction he thought led back to the village, his steps quick and uneven. The air was colder now, searing his throat with every breath. The whispers followed, growing louder with each step, until they became a low, keening wail. Suddenly, Jack emerged into a clearing. At its center stood an old well, its stones cracked and covered in ice. Strange symbols were etched around its rim, glowing faintly with an unnatural blue light. The snow around the well was undisturbed, pristine, as though untouched by time. Jack hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to stay away. But the wail grew louder, and the ground beneath him trembled. He moved closer, drawn by a force he couldn't explain. As he approached, the air around the well grew impossibly cold, and frost began creeping up his boots. He peered into the well, his flashlight beam illuminating the darkness below. For a moment, there was nothing but endless black. Then, something moved, a flash of white, quick and unnatural. Jack stumbled back as a figure clawed its way up the well's walls. Its body was skeletal, its skin stretched tight over frostbitten bones. Its face was frozen in a grotesque grin, icicles dangling from its jaw. It locked its hollow eyes on him, and a voice, guttural and inhuman, rasped, "The frost remembers you." The well erupted with a gust of icy wind, and Jack's flashlight shattered in his hand. Darkness consumed him once more. The freezing wind knocked Jack to the ground, stealing his breath as snow whipped violently around him. He scrambled to his feet, his hands raw and trembling, but the clearing was no longer silent. A deep guttural moan rose from the well, joined by the rasping breath of the figure clawing its way out. Jack turned to run, but his legs felt like lead. The frost clinging to his boots had crept upward, locking him in place. Panic surged through him as he pulled at the ice with his bare hands, his nails cracking against its unyielding surface. Behind him, the moaning grew louder. He dared a glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't. The figure had fully emerged from the well. It was taller than any human should be, its limbs unnaturally long and bent at impossible angles. Frost clung to its body like armor, and its empty eye sockets glowed faintly blue. The whispers returned, louder and clearer now. "You are marked. The frost does not forgive." Jack gasped as pain shot through his arm. He looked down to see intricate frostbitten patterns spreading across his skin, resembling the same snowflake symbols carved into the village doors. The ice burned as though it was alive, burrowing into his flesh. "No," he whimpered, shaking his head. "No, this isn't real." The creature let out a deafening scream, its jaw unhinging far beyond what was natural. The force of the sound sent Jack to his knees, his head pounding. The frost began spreading faster, snaking up his chest and down his legs. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single voice. "Join us, or feed the frost." Desperate, Jack clawed at the icy ground, dragging himself forward inch by inch. He didn't know where he was going. There was no path, no escape, but he couldn't stay. The creature's footsteps crunched behind him, impossibly slow, as though savoring his suffering. Suddenly, Jack's hand hit something hard beneath the snow. Digging frantically, he uncovered a small, rusted axe. Without thinking, he grabbed it and swung blindly behind him. The blade struck the creature's arm with a sickening crack. Black ice oozed from the wound, and the creature let out a guttural roar. But instead of retreating, it grew taller, its body contorting grotesquely. The frost surged up Jack's neck, clawing toward his face as the creature lunged. Jack swung the axe again, this time aiming for the creature's head. The blade connected, shattering part of its frost-covered jaw. The creature howled, the sound reverberating through the clearing like a winter storm unleashed. Jack seized the moment to claw at the frost encasing his legs, his fingers numb and bleeding. With one final desperate pull, he broke free and stumbled toward the trees, the axe clenched tightly in his frozen hands. The whispers followed him, merging with the wind, calling his name over and over. "Jack! Jack! The frost will find you." He crashed through the dense forest, the snow seeming to deepen with every step. The pain in his arm was unbearable, the frostbite pattern now etched across his chest like a living tattoo. Every movement burned, as if the frost were feeding on him. He didn't stop running until the forest opened into another clearing, this one dominated by an old stone cabin. Its windows were frosted over, and smoke curled faintly from the chimney. Against every instinct, Jack bolted for the door, throwing himself inside and slamming it shut. The warmth hit him like a wave, and he collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a fire crackling in the hearth. A figure sat in a chair by the fire, its back to him. Jack froze. "Who are you?" he croaked. The figure turned slowly, revealing an elderly man with a face weathered by years of cold. His eyes were piercing and unsettling, and his voice was low and gravelly. "You've seen it, haven't you?" The frost-marked Jack staggered backward. "What's happening to me? What was that thing?" The man stood, his frail form somehow commanding. "The frost isn't just cold, it's alive, and it remembers those who disturb its slumber. That mark on your arm, it's claimed you." Jack shook his head, panic rising. "No, there has to be a way to stop it." The man's expression darkened. "There's only one way. You must return to the heart of the frost and face it. If you don't, the mark will consume you. You'll become one of them." Before Jack could respond, the windows shattered and the freezing wind surged into the cabin. The man shouted, "Run, boy! It's already here!" The door burst open, and the frostbitten creature loomed in the doorway, its hollow eyes glowing brighter. The creature's guttural growl filled the cabin as the freezing wind howled through the shattered windows. Jack grabbed the axe, his hands trembling as he backed away. The elderly man stood firm, glaring at the frostbitten monster. "Go, boy!" the man shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Find the well! Face the frost! I'll hold it here!" "I can't just leave you," Jack protested. But the man turned, his eyes fierce. "You don't have a choice. If you don't stop it, you'll become worse than that thing." He gestured toward the creature, whose twisted form now filled the doorway. "Go now, while you still can." The creature lunged, and the man grabbed a burning log from the fire, hurling it at its face. Flames licked at the frost-covered monster, forcing it to retreat momentarily. Jack took the chance to run, bolting through the back door into the icy night. The wind was relentless, biting through his coat as he stumbled back into the forest. The whispers surrounded him again, louder and more insistent. Return to the frost. Return to the heart. The mark on his arm burned fiercely now, as if guiding him. His body moved almost of its own accord, weaving through the trees until the forest opened into the same clearing with the cursed well. The snow glowed faintly blue, and the well pulsed with an eerie rhythm matching the heartbeat in Jack's ears. He approached cautiously, the whispers merging into one commanding voice. Sacrifice, feed the frost, free the mark. Jack gripped the axe, his knuckles white. "What do you want from me?" he yelled into the void. The wind stilled. From the shadows of the trees, figures emerged, dozens of them, frostbitten, skeletal, their hollow eyes fixed on him. They formed a circle around the well, blocking any chance of escape. The voice returned, deeper now, resonating from the well itself. The frost takes what is owed. A life for freedom. A soul for release. Jack's breathing quickened as he realized what it meant. It wanted him to sacrifice himself to lift the curse. The frostbitten figures began to close in, their hands reaching for him. "No!" he shouted, raising the axe. "There has to be another way." The ground beneath him cracked, ice spreading outward. From the well, a massive hand, skeletal and covered in frost, began to emerge. The massive hand clawed its way out of the well, dragging with it a towering figure of frost and shadow. Its form was grotesque, skeletal yet impossibly large, with hollow, glowing eyes that burned like icy fire. The frostbitten figures surrounding the well bowed their heads in unison as the creature rose to its full height. Jack stood frozen, the axe slipping slightly in his trembling grip. The air around him was so cold now that his breath barely formed, his body trembling violently. The mark on his arm burned, spreading icy tendrils across his chest and down his legs. The creature's deep, resonant voice echoed through the clearing. "The mark cannot be undone. You must choose, your life or theirs." Jack's mind raced as he realized the truth. This wasn't just about him. The frost had claimed the villagers of Glens Hollow long ago, binding their souls to its eternal winter. If he didn't act, he would join them, becoming another frostbitten servant of the well. But if he sacrificed himself, would it truly end the curse? Or would the frost simply claim another? The figures closed in, their skeletal hands reaching for him. Jack gripped the axe tightly, his teeth chattering. "I won't let you take me," he snarled, "and I won't let you take anyone else." The towering frost creature leaned closer, its hollow eyes narrowing. "Then prove your worth, mortal. Face the frost's heart." The ice cracked violently as the well opened into a glowing abyss. Without thinking, Jack sprinted toward it, leaping into the void. The freezing air swallowed him as he fell, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. He landed hard on an icy platform deep within the earth. Before him stood the heart of the frost, a massive crystal, pulsating with a sickly blue light. The tendrils of frost that had marked him now reached out to the heart, connecting him to it. Jack raised the axe, his breath shallow. The frost's voice screamed in his mind. "You cannot destroy me. I am eternal." Summoning every ounce of strength, Jack swung the axe into the crystal. The impact sent a shockwave through the cavern, shattering the heart into 1,000 shards. A blinding light filled the space as the frost screamed in agony. The mark on Jack's body burned one final time before dissolving. He collapsed, gasping for air, as the frostbitten figures around the well disintegrated, their souls freed. When he awoke, the snow had stopped. The clearing was empty, the well reduced to rubble. The frost had lifted, leaving Glens Hollow eerily quiet. Jack limped back to his car, the axe still in his hand. But as he started the engine, he noticed frost creeping along the edges of the windshield, and a faint whisper echoed in his mind. "The frost never forgets."